This is Christmas 1989. This is Hal Kirn. The tape you're about to hear was recorded in Council Bluffs, Iowa, following the 50th wedding anniversary of Gerald and Ida Kirn. The year was 1970. Mother was 80 years old. Dad was 81. After the reception, Kay Kirn Lund, John Kirn, my son, and I stayed behind to record this impromptu interview with Mom and Dad at the family home, 740 Lindbergh Drive. In order to keep the flavor of the spontaneous conversation, very little of the tape has been edited. Although the four of us children, Catherine, George, Barbara, and I, always listed in that order, have heard most of the stories before, this tape may serve as a valuable oral history of two remarkable people for the generations that follow them, and us. Your grandfather's they had five brothers.
I think that's
the ministers. Tell us that, because I always forget it.
There were four brothers. The oldest was Frederick, who was a farmer and who later became a minister. The second was John, who also was a farmer and was a minister. And then my Aunt Barbara, and she married a farmer. Then Dad came. He became a college professor, dean of a college. And the youngest was William, who farmed the home farm.
They were all born in this country, though.
They were all born in this country. My grandfather, whose name was Frederick, and my grandmother came from Germany.
Who went to Canada at that time?
Well, that's a different family. On my mother's side, my grandfather Alice was, first of all, he came from Germany, and my grandmother came from Alsace. She was a French derivation. And they came over, yes, her name was Valentine. They came to New York, and my mother was born in Syracuse, New York. Then he transferred to the Canadian Conference, and they lived at Stratford, and, well, I don't remember, quite a number of Canadian towns. They lived there for many years. Then he transferred to the Michigan Conference, and they were living in Seaboy, Michigan when my father met my mother, and they were married later. When Father graduated from college and into the ministry, it was the custom in those days, since they had no theological seminary, to apprentice these men to an experienced minister. And Dad was sent as an assistant to Reverend Alice at Seaboy, Michigan. And he went there shortly after his graduation from Northwestern College at Naperville. He met Mother in the fall, and they were married in March.
How many children were in your mother's family?
My mother's family had 16 living children. And
think of it.
Well, what area? All of the Michigan area? And
no, they scattered all over the world, but most of them lived in Michigan. They lived in the Detroit area.
Grand Rapids.
And in Grand Rapids. Most of them lived in Michigan, but my Aunt Jean, of course, lived in Alaska, and she finally lived in California. And my Uncle Jonathan died in California. And
is that Alice? That'd be Alice too?
His name was Alice, yes.
A-L-L-E-S.
A-L-L-E-S. And he's buried in that famous cemetery in Los Angeles.
Forest Lawn.
Forest Lawn.
So is Barbara, I thought. I thought Barbara was buried.
No, Barbara lived in Imlay City, Michigan, as far as I know. Oh, you're talking about Aunt Jean.
Oh, your Aunt Jean.
But Aunt Jean, I don't know where Aunt Jean is buried.
Well, that's where you got the Barbara Jean.
Her name was Regina, but we called her Jean.
Oh. I didn't know Barbara Jean
And
was that.
Catherine,
It
you
was
are
named
named for
anyway.
the two mothers, for my mother.
No, Barbara was my aunt on my father's side. They had one daughter, and her name was Barbara. And mother had three sisters, and the youngest of them was named Regina. But she was always our favorite aunt. We always called her Aunt Jean. And so when Barbara came along, we called her Barbara Jean. Now you, in turn, were named after my mother, whose name was Sophia Catherine, and Edith's mother, whose name was Anna. And so we called you Catherine Ann. So you were named after your two grandmothers. And Barbara after two great aunts.
What was grandmother's middle name?
My mother?
Yeah.
Vic, on the Vic.
Well, that was her maiden name, wasn't it?
That's what you want.
No, it was
The
Vic
middle
Thorvald.
name, I don't know that she had a middle name. We never heard it. Just Anna Vic.
Oh.
In the Hardangerfield, at the top we have Vic. Have you been there,
I've
haven't
been
you?
there, yeah.
So you asked Mother to tell the story about the Sutherland story.
No, I don't know.
Oh,
That's
the story is that my my great grandmother, I think. You see, in those days, Norway bought many of their ships from Scotland, and the son of the owner of the Scottish shipyards came to deliver a ship to Norway and fell in love with this Norwegian girl and wanted to marry her. And the father said to him, "You come back in a year if you still want to marry her, it's all right with me." So he came back the next year and married her, and they went to Scotland. And then after he died, I think she came back to Norway. Father, you see, as a young boy, apprenticed as a sailor, it was all over the world. And Mother had a pair of red shoes they bought in Italy for her. She was so proud of them. She said when she was a little girl, he would give presents to them. And then later on, when he was grown and older, he had his own ship. And they would go up to the Lofoten Islands for ships. For
Fish.
Fish, I mean.
Do they come over separately?
Yes, grandfather came first. He came to New Orleans. He came up to Missouri, and he got a job on the Bismarck Capitol. He stopped off here at Council Bluffs, and he said, "Oh, this was a tough place. They want him to stay as a policeman because he was big and strong, you know." But he went down to Bismarck, and he worked on the Capitol there. And then afterwards, grandmother and the children came, and he met them in Chicago, I think, or did he meet them in Montreal? I think he met them in Montreal, maybe. They came over.
They had known each other in Norway.
Oh, well, they were married, and there were four children.
Oh, they were married.
They were married.
How old was she? 6? I thought she was 16 when she came to this country.
Oh, well, that was my mother, yes, mother, but grandmother and her four children came to live with grandfather. They settled in Portland, North Dakota.
He's the one we saw when we were small, who was 96 years old.
I didn't see him.
Well, you may know him.
He's the one in Washington, D.C. There's a picture of Olaf, I think, and my father was a model. My grandfather was a model for that.
Who painted that picture?
I don't
You don't
know.
know where it is?
I don't know. I think it's in the Washington. Well, I don't know where it is.
Sons of Norway had it or something.
Washington, D.C., anyway. But my grandfather was very big and strong and tall. And that's where we got our
He
reddish
had red
hair.
hair, didn't he?
But he adored grandmother. Grandmother was so cute always. I remember she was so cute and cuddly. She had lovely, beautiful arms, I remember. And there were dimples in them. She was a darling.
Was she small?
She was quite small. Not very tiny, not as small, I think, as Gerald's mother, but very small. And he was big and tall and strong. And then they went afterwards, after he left Portland, he sold a store there, and he had a restaurant, I think. And he sold that and took a claim up in northern Minnesota near Wonky, Minnesota. He took
To farm.
farm, and Uncle Jacob took a farm nearby. I visited them there. There were many Indians. One night the Indians had been there, and the next morning we found a papoose case in the straw stack where they spent the night with the baby. But grandfather was a friend of the Indians up there in northern Minnesota. There are many Indians all around.
Tell the kids about some of your early days, where your father traveled around, what he did as a minister. That's what
He was a minister.
My father was a minister up in Michigan, and in those days the ministers had to move every 2 or 3 years. And after my mother and father were married, they were in a little town of Bern, and then they moved where my older sister was born, and then they moved to Eureka, which is a little town in Clinton County.
Isn't that where what's the New York man who ran for the president? He comes from
No.
Eureka?
No.
He came from
Owasso. He came from Owasso. Then my father was reared on a farm near Owasso, but as a minister, he was at Eureka, where I was born. And then we moved to Jackson, Michigan, where my sister was born. And then we lived in Cairo and Sebowing. And then my father was made a presiding elder, and a presiding elder is really a supervising minister who has charge of 1/4 of the state of Michigan. And he was there, we lived in Flint, Michigan for 4 years.
Tell us how we
And
got.
then at a salary of $75 a month. But that wasn't so bad, because a minister in those days would travel for 1/4 the regular price on the railroad, so he could travel practically for nothing. But he had to visit all the churches in 1/4 of the state of Michigan. Then he was assigned to southwestern Michigan, to Buchanan, which is a great fruit belt. But in the meantime, he had gotten his doctor's degree and had written a book, Religion and Rational Demand, and on the basis of that, he was hired as a college professor at Northwestern College at Naperville, Illinois. And we moved there when I was a boy of 12 years old. And I went to school there in the preparatory college and also in the regular college. And I graduated when I was 19 years of age.
Why did Northwestern become North Central then?
Northwestern always was confused with Northwestern University, and there was a Northwestern College up in Wisconsin someplace. There were 2 or 3 Northwesterns, and so later on in about 1930, they changed the name from Northwestern College to North Central College.
You told us before your father rode a horse, too, on his circuit ride.
In the early days, the roads were so bad, particularly in the spring and the fall, that father used to ride a horseback, to meet his engagements to preach. You see, transportation was difficult in those days, so instead of having a central church, they would have a series of churches. Many of them met in schoolhouses on a Sunday afternoon. And in order to meet his appointments at these churches, my father had to ride a horseback. And later on, he made those appointments with horse and buggy. As a youngster, we always had a horse and buggy.
What was the name of this famous white horse that you...
Nellie.
How many churches would he preach in?
Oh, sometimes 3 or 4 in addition to the main church. And he'd meet them, he couldn't meet them all on Sunday, but he'd sometimes have 2 services in the morning, and then he would have 2 appointments in the afternoon, and then he was back again to preach in the evening. He'd preach 5 times on a
German,
Sunday.
mostly in German.
Well, his first service was German, for the German people, and then there was a Sunday school. Then there was an English service. And then there was a young people's society at 6:30 and at night, and then there was a preaching service at 7:30, which was English. There were 2 English services and a German.
Then on Wednesday they had services too.
And Wednesday we had a prayer meeting. And then Friday night there was always a...
He'd have a conference with his ministers. Are they always able to, like a college education, to have?
Yes, whenever he... father was a student, and he prided himself that he read most of the newer books that came out on theology and philosophy. He loved philosophy. And when he would meet these ministers at the weekend, he would always have a conference with them in regard to their church work and their organization. And the ministers used to say that it was like getting a college education whenever the Reverend George John Kirn came to visit them as a presiding elder.
How did you get interested in being a principal for the school?
Well, when I was in college, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. And so when I graduated from college, I went out to a little town of Madison, Minnesota, and I was the athletic coach, and I taught science. I had 6 classes, and I had to teach bookkeeping and commercial arithmetic because they didn't have anybody else to teach that. Although I had never had them in school, I had to teach them. After a year there, I went to Faribault, Minnesota, and there I taught merely science and was an athletic coach for 2 years. And when the principal left, the superintendent came to me and asked me to be the principal. So then I was the principal of a high school for 2 years, and then we had a junior high school organized, and I was principal of that for 3 years. And then we organized a junior college, and I was the dean of that for 2 years. So I was the principal for 5 years before I came here. And I was a principal here for 27 years.
How old were you when you were first the principal?
23.
But I'm the only one who was taught in the college, though, huh?
Well, in a certain sense, yes.
To a certain degree.
You left Minneapolis and taught in St. Olaf College, but I used to teach.
Omaha University.
But I used to teach in the summer school. First, I taught at Omaha University for 3 summers, and then Creighton University asked me to teach there, and I taught there 2 years. And then I went back to Omaha U, and then I went back to Creighton again. So in all, I taught 7 or 8 years in summer school.
Summers.
Did you teach Norwegian?
I taught Norwegian. Well, first I was preceptress at the Waldorf College in Forest City. And Father thought it was too far from home and I should be near, so I taught at East Grand Forks. I taught German and commercial arithmetic, and I forget what else.
Was that high school?
High school. And then I went to Minneapolis, and I was there 4 years, and then Bo, who was at Waldorf when I first wanted me to come to St. Olaf, so I was engaged to teach the mathematics department, but Relvog asked me to be his assistant, so I taught Norwegian for 4 years. And then after I married, St. Olaf.
I didn't remember it. No, I didn't remember that.
1 year at St. Olaf and 4 at Minneapolis.
Oh, 1 year at St. Olaf.
1 year.
Because I was married then. And Bo said, what do you want to get married for? He said, you could stay here as long as you want to.
Why did you want to get married?
Why?
Because of your father.
Then in the meantime, I was in the superintendent's office, and I saw a letter there on his desk that was in...
That was in Council Bluffs.
In Council Bluffs, that was in Ida's handwriting. And I said, well, how come you're getting letters from my fiancée? And I discovered that he had written her and asked her if she didn't want to teach in the high school. So she taught social science in the high school.
Until you were stopped
Before
everything.
she's even married, yes.
No, after we were married. She taught for 1 semester.
Then you came,
And
so
then,
I had to quit teaching.
Catherine was coming, so she quit teaching.
Then I substituted a lot, and then afterwards I taught at Omaha Central High School for years, and at Omaha University. After the war, they were deluged with veterans, you know, and so I assisted at Omaha University at the reading clinic.
Well, she was principal out at Underwood for 1 year. Well, I was talking to a girl at one of the class reunions the other day, and she said, oh, I can remember Mrs. Kirn when she substituted. And she said, you know, I hate to admit it, but I used to pray that my teacher would be sick so Mrs. Kirn would come and teach our class because we loved her so much.
Did you really meet Mother on the streetcar? Is that a true story?
Well,
Yeah,
yes,
we were
the
at
first
a
time
convention.
I met her, she was a very close friend of one of my teachers. And this woman was continually telling me about this paragon person is this
Ida Hagen.
Ida Hagen. And so when we went to a state meeting in Minneapolis, as we got off the car, she got off the car with Ida, and she called me over and introduced me
I don't remember that at all.
to Ida in front of West High School in Minneapolis. And that's all. And there was no romance. It was just a casual meeting. But then later on, she visited Tora down at Faribault, and I met her there. But really, the romance began when I was in the service in officers training camp in Minneapolis, and I had some dates with her while I was at Fort Snelling.
What was the story in your family? Was it your father who
Father was an
grandmother
editor.
in a buggy and threatened to throw himself off the bridge?
Well, that was after mother and he was sweet on my mother. She was a young girl, he was a young man. And the Arnold was in love with my mother. So father was mad and jealous. And so one time they were out for a buggy ride, my mother and dad. And he proposed marriage, and she wasn't going to marry him. And so he lashed up the horse and went lickety-split. I remember when he came home, my grandmother was terribly worried about what had happened, But nothing had happened.
Well, Tom Arnold was wealthy and he had beautiful horses, didn't he?
Well, the Arnolds came from Kentucky originally, and they had a lovely home near Portland. Of course, it's lovely then, it is now, I suppose. But near Portland, North Dakota.
Well, how did grandfather get into photography? Or in newspapers?
No. My grandfather first, I think because he worked for Scrieveseth, who was a photographer. I think father worked for him. And then he became an editor. He always wanted to write. He went to a college in Wilmar, North Dakota. It isn't there, Dale says it isn't there anymore.
Wasn't it a theological institution?
No, it was, maybe so, I don't know. But every summer father would peddle stuff. In those days there were peddlers all over, many men. And so he would earn money that way during the summer.
What, selling what?
Oh, selling everything.
Needles and thread and whatever they
Everything
sold.
that the farmers wanted.
Was that when did he take those postcards around and did he sell?
No. Then when he became a photographer in Elbow Lake, Minnesota, he made that picture of his mother. She sits in the middle. He wanted to show how the pioneers, the women used to make wool, and make yarn. And so he got the two neighbor women in, and my grandmother is sitting in the middle, and we lived in the back of the gallery. And that was the time when I came running in with my doll. I wanted my dolls to be on the picture. And father took a picture of me in the front there with the doll. And mother was so embarrassed because my hair hadn't been combed. It was early Saturday morning and my hair hadn't been combed. But he didn't care, of course. I have lots of those postcards. You may have some if you want them. So father was an editor of Vestheim, and those books, I think Uncle George has all of the copies of the Vestheim.
He has them bound, yeah.
When I was in Norway, and the crowd came out, of course, hundreds of them came out. They lined the streets, so we had to walk down the middle of the street with the crowds of people on all sides. And that was one night the King and the Queen came to our concert. And so the Mr. Jurgen Thompson came downstairs and said, "Hurry up and get upstairs! You've got to be on the stage before they come in." So we lined up, and the King and the Queen came down the aisle. I remember with their equerries and their ladies and the lady in waiting, and the Queen was put down on a chair, and she had a cushion to put her feet on, a lovely. And I remember I thought it was so unqueenly. She didn't like the place where the lady had put the cushion, so with her feet she took it like this and she moved it, and I thought, oh boy, that was unqueenly.
Well, she was a little woman, wasn't she?
Queen Maud, she was little, she was tiny, and Hawken was rather tall. But we sang for them, and afterwards, of course, they came up and gave it. But she had a lorgnette, and she would look at us. We'd become nervous. She'd be looking at us and we're singing. And one man up in the gallery when we sang "Wake, Awake, for Night is Coming," you know, that beautiful Norwegian song that Chris Johnson had arranged. And of course we sang it with gusto. And the man up in the balcony stood up and said, "Oh my!" He stood up. We remember that so well. Oh my!
I'm a coach at the universities.
Well, I coached football. I wasn't the only coach of football. I was one of the coaches of football, and then I coached basketball. And I coached, in the spring, I coached track and baseball.
Where was that?
At Madison, I taught football, basketball, track, and baseball, so that when I set up my laboratory experiments, I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, go over and set up my apparatus that I was going to use for demonstration purposes in my class. And at 7 o'clock I went down to the hotel for my breakfast and came back and taught all day long.
You were
And I got $60 a month.
Were you only 19 years old then?
19 and 20. I became 20 while I was there. And the joke of it was, the next fall, I lived at the home of an attorney. I was teaching then in Faribault High School, who was running for a district judge. And I liked him very much, and so I did some work for him. And on the day of election, his wife said to me, "Have you voted yet?" And I said, "No." "Well, aren't you going to vote for Arthur?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to vote for Arthur." And she looked at me strangely and said, "Why not?" And I said, "I'm not old enough."
Oh dear. Those were the days. But believe me, I coached basketball down at the Waldorf.
Everything Dad has done, Mother's done.
It's true.
I don't know a thing about it.
Principal.
She never coached track.
She didn't.
No, but I coached basketball. When I was receptionist, I was one of the funny. One girl had been naughty, and the president said I should call her in for a talk. So when I met her, we lived in the same building, you know. And she met me as I was coming down the steps, and she was going up to my room. And she said, "Have a Hershey, Miss Hagan." And so, of course, that knocked me cuckoo. I didn't have the heart to say anything more to her.
What was it for preceptress? We don't know.
Preceptress, I had 80 girls to take charge of.
You were a house mother?
I was
Dean of women? Or
Dean
what?
of women. I was preceptress,
They don't call it that. Huh?
they called them. And they had 80 girls in there. And I remember one time, of course, those girls, one time one girl had lice, and I had to cure her. That was terrible. Or I
Is that
put
the
cotton.
problem you had, just lice and things like that?
That was only, the girls were good as gold. This was the only naughty one. I remember that one that I was
Did what she was going through.
Yeah, it was lice.
That's right.
Oh, they were good girls, 80 of them.
Let's talk a little about the reception.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
the wedding reception. Well, everyone said the children were lovely and well behaved and very courteous. Could you put that down?
Grandchildren, you mean?
The grandchildren.
Yeah, we were very proud of the grandchildren.
They were wonderful, all of them.
And everybody spoke complimentarily of them.
How many were there?
We don't know yet, but
And the grandchildren?
Oh,
We had 9 grandchildren there, and we had all of our children, of course.
everyone was so glad
So
to
many
see you
people
for it.
have called us and said that they thought it was as perfect a reception as they'd ever had. Tell about who decorated the hall.
The garden club took charge of the room with Catherine Schofield as a chairman, and they put flowers in every window, and the janitor told them they weren't supposed to put flowers in the window, and she didn't care. She put them there anyway. And everybody helped. All our relatives, except Harold and the boys, were in homes overnight. Remember?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember I was there.
Go on, Dad.
Who served?
Amy Crabb and Mrs. Davenport served the punch different hours. from our reception was from 2 to 4. And then the guest book was arranged or taken care of by Mrs. Lucy Bell Graham and Mrs. John Hanson. And the coffee was served by Kathleen Schofield and Mrs. Lighters of Fremont.
Who cut the cake? There were ladies cutting cake.
Amy Crabb and Esther Maxwell cut the cake.
When Harold was a young man or a young boy in high school or in grade school and high school, he had a friend by the name of Anderson, Gerald Anderson, and we lived then on Lower Harrison. And they used to build a house in the backyard.
Under the kitchen window.
When the house was done, they would put in curtains and make it very livable. And as soon as it was done, they would
have something to eat. I'd make sandwiches for them.
Then they would tear it down and rebuild and build an entirely different house. And then when we moved over on 2nd Avenue, Catherine had a puppet show. And she had some puppets, and Harold became very much interested, and he not only would develop the puppets, make them and operate them, but he would also create the story, the theme.
There's a rub.
What story?
Mrs. Gimmiston was there that day. She mentioned the puppets, and I said, were you there the time I did the show that embarrassed Mother and Dad? She didn't remember that part of it. But
what did you do?
It was a triangle.
Such a kid. Triangle. You told the story of mommy.
Oh, you had modern stories, then you didn't have Cinderella and that.
But your father was in the orchestra, and Harold and Patsy Payne used to play piano duets that were beautiful.
And what are some funny things about Katie? Till we get this on tape.
Katie? Well, I remember one time she was an angel in the Christmas show at the church. She was supposed to be an angel. And I looked up to my heart. She was chewing gum as hard as she could hear. She was supposed to be an angel. Do you remember that?
When Catherine was a little girl, I used to go to Chicago to the North Central Association. And I don't think Catherine was over 3 years old when I took her with me. And I took her to Naperville and left her with my father and her aunt while I went into the meeting, and then I would pick them up when I came home. And I remember the first time I ever took her, she was a little bit of a girl. We went into the dining car for breakfast, and Catherine sat up to the table. They had to put something under her in order to make it high enough for her, and she ate like a little experienced traveler. I was so proud of her. She did everything just right. One time when I was coming back from school, Emma Pierce, who was a teacher who lived next door and who thought as much of our children as we did, had George over her knee and she was paddling him. And in explanation, she said, you know that when I looked out, the streetcar comes up and turns around on a Y and reverses its direction, and that George was out there pushing the streetcar. So she said, I took him and gave him a good whipping so that he'd never do that again. At another time, he was riding his tricycle, and his mother had warned him not to go down the driveway onto the street. But he had done that, and a car just grazed him and knocked him down, but didn't hurt him any. And so his mother took him to one side. Now you take the story from then on.
I took him in the house, and I said once a little boy had done that, and he was killed by the mother and daddy cried, and I made it as gruesome as I could. And when I was all through,
they had to put him away in the ground.
Put him away in the cold
ground. They didn't have any boy
anymore. Well, I made a sad story, and I thought his eyes were so big, he looked at me. And finally, when I was all through it, I expected that he would have been impressed. He said, where's the tricycle now? That's all the impression.
Who put the doll in the refrigerator? Whose story was that? Was that
That was Catherine.
That was Catherine. Catherine had a doll
Lily.
A rag
that
doll,
she
Lily.
called Lily. And Lily got kind of dirty after a while, and because she played with her out on the sand pile. And one day we couldn't find Lily anywhere, and Catherine never wanted to go to sleep without Lily being in her arms. And she wouldn't go to sleep. She wouldn't. And we looked and we looked and we looked all over. We couldn't find it. And finally, Catherine brightened up, and she went to the refrigerator, opened the door, and there was Lily, where she had put her for good safekeeping.
No, it was a hot night. And I thought Lily
it was a hot night, and she thought Lily would be much more comfortable there than in her bed.
Yeah.
What is the Barbara story?
I always remember Barbara was the only one who ever talked about it. Dad told her to do something, and she said, I don't have to. Her big brown eyes, and she looked at Dad.
She got by with it, I
She
bet.
got by
When
with
Barbara
it.
was a little girl, and also George was, Harold was a baby at that time, the Des Moines Register put on a statewide contest for the most beautiful baby. And of course we were sure we had the two most beautiful babies that were in the state. So we entered both of them, and they got honorable mention in the local contests, and they went on to the state contest. And we were disappointed because Barbara got second place, and she got second place largely because the girl who got first place, it was not a conventional picture. It was a girl standing among some flowers, and it was an unusual picture. We didn't think she was as beautiful as Barbara, but she got first place and Barbara got second. An honorable mention went to Harold, so both of our entries in the state contest got high rating.
One time I remember I overheard Barbara or Catherine and George talking about me. First about who fed the babies in heaven. You remember that? And you didn't know who fed the babies in heaven. That was before you were born, I think. And George said, well, the angels did that. The angels did that. They gave them the bottles. Another time, you and Harold and George were discussing my age, and finally George said, well, she's 80. I'm sure she's 80.
Well, I can remember the time that both Barbara and Harold were in the orchestra of the Abraham Lincoln High School, and we went to Colorado Springs. And it was the rule there that when you participated in a contest, people were not to applaud. But our orchestra played in a small hall that was for the dramatics department. And when the orchestra got through playing, without any sign from anybody, the audience just rose en masse and applauded them, and that probably was the finest presentation of any music number that had ever been given by an orchestra of the Abraham Lincoln High School. And we got a #1 rating in orchestra and band and in choir, and I don't remember whether we had a boys' glee club then or not, but we got a #1 rating in everything that we entered at Colorado
Do they
Springs.
still do that anymore? Do they have those?
No, we have not.
The contests are no longer going. What happens always, and that's a strange thing, the people who excel want to continue that sort of thing, but the organizations in which the majority of the people don't excel always want to denigrate it. They always want to belittle it, and the result is that during the Depression, many of these beautiful contests of bands and orchestras were discontinued and never have been reinstated. Now they bring an expert and they hold a clinic, and that saves them the expense of moving great masses of people. When we went to Iowa City, at one time we took 376 pupils from here to Iowa City to participate in a state music contest.
Well, they went to Colorado Springs one time.
When we went to Colorado Springs, we had over 200, as I recall it.
Do you remember the time you were asked to play at the White House?
Yeah, I didn't play though, did I?
No, they said
that
the piano was out of tune.
That was for Harry Truman.
For Harry Truman.
Oh, that's
And they had the piano there. Well, he didn't tell me till afterwards. That was it. He said he was ready to, and then something happened. But we had sung. The Glee Club had sung there.
To play the piano for Harry, it was pretty good.
Well,
Let's see what else
What
you
else?
think. What about Barbara and George? We haven't very much about them.
Well, George took a book out of the library one time.
Oh, that's right.
And the dog got a hold of it and mutilated it considerably. Well, he didn't want to take it back to the library, but his mother made him go back and report to Miss Cannon, the librarian. And Miss Cannon, being a very wise woman, took him to task for the mutilation of the book, and knowing exactly what his mother wanted her to do, she fined him and made him replace the book, but made it possible for him to pay by installments. So he had to go back and see her every week and make his payment until he paid for that book.
What do you suppose the charge was then?
Oh, the charge was not excessive. It was about $1, and he had to pay, I think, 10 cents a week until.
But I hope you learned his lesson.
Where do you get the 10 cents?
The idea was, of course, that's relatively important where he got it. The idea was to teach him responsibility, that when he had other people's property or his own property, that he had to take care of it, and that if he didn't, he had to make good the damage that was done even by his dog.
One time Barbara went to a birthday party, I forget whose it was, and when she came home, as usual, I asked, did she have a good time, and what did they have to eat, and did you like her mother, and so on. And when I said, did you like her mother? Oh, I don't know, Mother, but I liked her not. She said, I don't think so, because she never says no to her children. She never says no.
At another time, Barbara went to a party. They played Drop the Handkerchief. And her mother had always told her that if there were any of the little girls who didn't participate, that she should participate with them and get them to participate so that they'd have a good time too. So her mother asked her when she came home whether she enjoyed playing or Drop the Handkerchief. And she said yes, she did. But there was a little girl there that never participated, but she said, I dropped my handkerchief behind her, and I think she had a good time, but Mother, she said, I didn't like her very well. She smelled.
She smelled, she said. She smelled.
Well, what's the story about George and the maid that he hid behind the chair or something, this maid you had?
Don't you remember we had the maid?
You went out for the evening.
We went out for the evening.
Oh, yes. One time we'd hired a new maid, and she evidently wasn't any good. And she wanted what time we would come back and all about it. Well, as soon as we left, she had her boyfriend come. And she sat in his lap.
No, he sat in
Well,
hers.
first she sat in his lap,
George
and
told the
then they changed it. And George hid, but she made them all go to bed. And then George, while she was in the kitchen feeding him something, George hid behind the big brown chair. And he overheard everything that they said, and then he said, or she said, you better sit in my lap. So then he sat in her lap in the brown chair. George heard it. And the next morning, the children were all breathless. They were coming in to tell us. So we fired the girl that night. She was no good anyway.
She was quite fat, so that's why he had to sit in her lap.
I guess so.
Well, but they caught him at it, and
Oh, she was mad at George.
And she was mad at George and forced George to go to bed.
Then you remember when Harold had pneumonia and the nurse had always mistreated him. We found all kinds of pin pricks where she'd put on his diaper and had the safety pin stuck him, and he was so cried.
Well, she told me that I shouldn't come and visit her. Mother was in the hospital at the time.
No, I was homesick.
And Harold had pneumonia, and he was in the hospital, so I used to see them both. But whenever I'd leave Harold, he'd always put his arms around my neck and say, well, Daddy, don't go. And so she said, I shouldn't come. because I always upset him, that he always cried when I left. And I couldn't understand it because we were always so close together. But when they got him home and we were changing his diaper, we found that there were she had stuck the pin in him, and there were a lot of pin. And then it was perfectly clear why.
So
he didn't want to see her and did want to see us.
But when Gerald put him to bed, he cried and didn't want to go to. So Gerald put him to bed right next to me, and I held your hand until you went to sleep. You were scared, I guess, that we would.
How was I? I was 2 years old, wasn't I?
You were.
No, you were just a little baby.
But oh boy, did I tell the doctor about the nurse.
Do you have any other stories about our various maids?
One of the maids threw out something, and they said we knew that you wouldn't.
Oh, that was Nellie.
That
was when Dad and I went to.
When Miss Folene, we went to dinner with Miss Folene at her home, and she had some very fine wine, of which she was quite proud. And she said, "Why don't you take the rest of this home with you?" And so we brought it home, and we put it in the cupboard, and forgot all about it. Didn't think about it. Well, in the meantime, Mother and I had gone to Portland, where I was to give a talk to the NEA, and we were gone for about 2 weeks because we had made a trip up through Seattle and back that way. And when we got back, one day I happened to think, well, whatever happened to that wine? And so Edith said something to Nellie about it, and she said, well, I was cleaning the cupboard and I found it there, and I said, somebody has been putting some wine here in order to embarrass Mrs. Kirn and Mr. Kirn, and so she quick poured it down the drain so that no one would know that we ever had any wine.
Because we never had any liquor in the house.
Because we wouldn't have liquor in the house.
Nellie thought the world of you kids, though. She always, after Christmas, I remember her with some money or a gift, and write her letter. She always asks about you children.
How old is she now? She was older than you, wasn't she?
I suppose. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. She's about the same age as we.
Another time.
She was a remarkable woman. She had no children of her own, but she reared 5 children.
8.
8.
Doesn't make a difference.
Well, she put them through college, didn't she, or something?
No, I don't think they went through college, but they went through high school.
Another time, Nellie was on the committee. They put her on the committee for the church convention because she worked for Mrs. Kirn, and Mrs. Kirn always set a beautiful table, they said. So Nellie was made the chairman of this committee, so she asked my advice what she should do for flowers and so on. I said, take some, because she had no vases, of course. I said, take some tin cans and cover them with crepe paper and put your flowers in that. Well, anyway, later on, I think she had a birthday party, didn't she?
No, it was a birthday party for George Washington.
Oh, was it? Well, anyway, then I sent some Gerald and I sent some red roses to her, a dozen red roses, and of course she tickled. Of course, that set her up, you could imagine, with all her college friends.
Well, it was a Colonian party.
Oh, that was another time.
The Colonian party. And I forget who was George Washington.
Her husband.
Her husband was George Washington.
What was his name?
I know, he was a good-looking guy.
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay Burke.
We were married in Faribault, Minnesota. And we were married at the home of my sister Delta and Elmer Bozart. My father came up from Naperville and married us. They were planning on having a joke on us, and so without our knowing it, they opened our suitcase and put in a lot of rice, and they tied tin kegs and whatnot to it, and they really did the thing up brown. And when we left, we didn't take it along. They had made the mistake and done that to Father's suitcase.
So where did you go on your honeymoon then?
Then we went to Minnesota.
And I can't tell you the whole time in Worcester the whole time.
We went to Minneapolis, and we went to the Radisson Hotel. We spent a couple of days there. Then we had been invited to go out to Lake Minnetonka. Ida had some very close friends who thought the world of her, and we spent a few days there at Lake Minnetonka. And then from there we went to Naperville to visit our folks. In the meantime, I had bought a home here in Council Bluffs, and we were eager to get here in order to equip it. It was a brand new house, and to buy our furniture and whatnot. So we finally got here, and they hadn't done one thing on the house after I had left. There were a number of things that they had to do. So we registered at the hotel, the Grand Hotel, and we started about our business and about our home and whatnot. And when I went back to the hotel, they said, you've been checked out. And I said, checked out? We didn't check out. No, Dutch White was here. And he checked you out, and he took your baggage and took it up to his home. So we went up to Dutch's home, and his wife was gone, and he was all alone. And he met us at home there, and he'd wake us up in the middle of the night and say, come on down. I brought some fresh corn in from he had a farm out here, and he had it all ready, and we'd sit and eat fresh corn and watermelon at all times of day or night.
What's the picture you have sitting in the garden? What was that? That was up on, that was here in
The one
Council
that Barbara
Bluffs.
had?
I thought that was a wedding picture. Or what was that? We had the candles, remember, set up?
Oh, they had a shower for me, St. Olaf, and that was
Oh, that was
shower.
St. Olaf? Oh, I wasn't.
That's before I was married to Leotos. But I must tell about Dutch White, how embarrassed I was. I took her out there and get tomatoes on a can of bushel of tomatoes for our family. And one time, and Dutch, of course, was very informal, and he was a fine man. But he said, I want you to see the basement room that he put under his cottage, or he is funny. So we went down there, and he had
a swing there, and she was sitting on the swing.
So he sat down beside me and talked. I was embarrassed to tears. He had nothing but winter underwear on, buffed up the front, you know. And here I thought, this is anybody tell Father about that, that would be terrible.
But he was perfectly unconscious of anything out of the way, and but it's good that I didn't catch them together.
You said you had cherries on your honeymoon. Where was that?
Oh, at Gerald, they had how many cherry trees?
That was at Naperville. We had 3 big cherry trees there that bore very fine cherries. And while we were there, the cherries were just right. And I picked some cherries.
Gerald pitted them.
And I pitted them, and Ida canned them.
Well, that was
we brought them home.
Lola and Charles were going to take us with them to the lake for a honeymoon, and they'd canceled. So we were in Naperville the whole time.
No, we went there expecting to go on a trip with Charles and Lo, and I don't know what happened, but they canceled at the last minute, so we were there for 3 or 4 days, and then we came here, although I do remember
3 or 4 days. We were there all summer for months.
No, we weren't.
Who officiated?
No, we weren't.
Who married you?
Well, Dad married us, but at Faribault. But I can remember when we were ready to get off of the sleeper when we came from Minneapolis to Naperville. The porter, Mother had a knit dress on. The porter began to brush her off, and he jokingly said that there was a little piece of yarn there, I think, and he said he'd be afraid to pull that because it might unravel the whole dress.
What dress did you wear?
Oh,
when you were married?
Pale pink chiffon. Pale pink, almost white chiffon. I don't wear it now. I suppose the good old got it long ago.
I hope so.
Well, that was 50 years ago.
I'm sure it had been.
But I told her on this anniversary that she was just as beautiful at this anniversary party Sunday as she was the day I married her. And so many people said how young she looked. How beautiful she was.
Well, Catherine and Barbara had fixed me up. Catherine fixed my hair, and Barbara, she had shirt and my dress, and fixed me all up.
And I had the privilege of buying her a corsage that people said they thought was the prettiest corsage they'd ever seen.